let's talk about multiple languages at one time. And this is something that I practice myself. I study 8 languages each and every day. Those languages are Japanese, Mandarin Chinese, Spanish, German, Teochew, which is a Chinese language, Korean, Sanskrit, and Arabic. There are also some other languages I study, but not every day, so I don't include them in the 8s. But I also study languages like Swedish, Italian, French, and Polish, as well as some others. But I like to make sure I study those 8 each and every day so I know I'm making progress. And this is something I've been doing for the last 2 or 3 years. I've learned languages for most of my life, and I've really started to learn these 8 languages each and every day for the last 2 or 3 years. So the first thing I want to go over is tomorrow is not guaranteed. And think about it. Think about your earliest memory in your life. Your earliest memory in your life, you were alive. And actually, all of the memories that you have up until this point, you were alive. Now, because 100% of the memories you were alive, this causes a kind of cognitive bias. Because if all of your memories you were alive, then you just sort of assume that's how it always is going to be. That's how it always was as far as you can know and remember. So you just assume on a subconscious level that that's just how it's always going to be. But we know on another level, on a logical level, that we all will die and we will cease to exist the way that you are right now. But something I want to point out is if you look at time, for most of time, you were not alive, at least in the current state that you're in. So if you were to look at it as not existing for most of time, and then being alive for less than 0.00001% of the time, you'd probably live your life a lot differently, wouldn't you? Because it would be such a rare occurrence for you to be alive compared to the time that you didn't exist. Have you ever wondered why people who have near-death experiences tend to go on to a new, better trajectory in life? It's because they get exposed to the idea of not being alive, or they actually have the memory of not being alive, or the potential of it. And this alone causes it to change their perspective in a way that they decide to live a more fulfilling life. So tomorrow is not guaranteed. And what I want to say is, if there's a language that you want to know, that you want to learn, you need to do it now, because you might not get a few years from now. You might not get next month. You might not get next week. You might not even get tomorrow. So if not now, then when? You have to do it now, because tomorrow is not guaranteed. So one of the most common arguments I get about learning multiple languages at one time is that if I learn multiple languages at the same time, especially if they're similar, won't I confuse them? Like if I'm learning Spanish and Portuguese, won't I start using Portuguese words when I'm trying to speak Spanish and vice versa? And to this I have to say that, yeah, it is true that at the beginning I did confuse languages, but that was mostly because I had the idea in my mind that there was one language, my native language, English, and then there was the foreign language that I was studying. And when I had this dichotomy where there was the native language and the foreign language, when I added additional foreign languages, it became confused because I still had only one category for foreign language. What you need to do is you need to create separation in different compartments for each language. then you can practice the skill of keeping them separated, and this is something that you can train so that you no longer confuse the languages. And I'm happy to say that at this time I don't confuse the languages. I don't speak Chinese words when I'm speaking Japanese. I don't speak Spanish words when I'm trying to speak French. It just doesn't happen. So something that we have to do is we have to juggle all of the languages that we learn. And why is this? The reason for this is because if you don't use a language, the language will begin to decay over time. And I remember an example of a Japanese guy. I wish I could figure out his name. I believe I learned about this guy when I was studying over in Tokyo. But basically, a Japanese soldier somehow got to either Ukraine or somewhere in Eastern Europe. And he got cut off from Japan, and he decided to lead his life in this new country. Let's just say it was Ukraine. He married a Ukrainian woman, he had Ukrainian friends. Of course, this was back in the 40s and 50s, so he didn't have access to Japanese media. He had no access to Japanese people. He could not hear the Japanese language. He had no contact with it whatsoever. And the interesting thing was that when they found this guy and tried to speak to him in Japanese like 40 years later, when he was in his 60s, he could not understand Japanese at all. I think he was able to remember like one or two words, but he couldn't remember how to speak Japanese, even though it was his native language, and he spoke it for the first 2 decades of his life. I think that's so interesting because we often take our native languages for granted. We just assume that our mother languages will always be there because we're able to speak them so easily right now. But even your mother tongue will decay if you don't use it. And I know this is true because when I used to live in Japan, I had some friends who were Americans, English speakers, and they wanted to learn Japanese really well. So they just spoke only in Japanese. They only had Japanese friends. They only listened to Japanese media. They used Japanese cell phones. They never looked at anything that was English. And they told me that even after 1 or 2 years of doing this, when they returned to America, they actually had trouble recalling words in English at times. It became more difficult to speak English because they had focused on Japanese only for 1 or 2 years. So again, this is an example that if you don't use a language, it will decay. Because if your mother tongue will decay, then surely a foreign language, a second language, a third language that you learn, that's definitely going to decay if you don't use it over time. So the point is, if you know that you want to be able to speak multiple languages in your lifetime, you have to figure out a way to balance them and juggle them so that you can practice them each and every day, or at least each and every week, so that they don't decay over time and you're able to use them. So something that I think is really great when you learn multiple languages is that you can approach it in one of 2 ways. The first way is that you learn languages that are similar to each other so that you can get the synergy for that. The second way is you learn languages that are just completely different from each other. And I guess the third technical way is you learn languages of both categories. So if you're into language families, let's say you want to learn the Northern Germanic languages like Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish. If that's the case, I highly recommend you get my book. It's a comparative grammar of Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish. I'll put a link to where you can buy this book on Amazon in the description below. And if you're interested in seeing more about this book, check out the video on my channel specifically about this book. But the reason I made this book is because I believe so much in learning multiple languages at the same time, especially if they're in the same language family. So what I did was I put examples of Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish side by side so that you can compare them and see how they're similar and different. I even went as far as putting examples of Swedish, Norwegian, and both Bokmål and Nynorsk, as well as Danish, Icelandic, and Faroese in the back with example sentences so you can see all of the Northern Germanic languages and see how they compare. But I think a book like this is so powerful because it allows you to make progress in all three languages, and because you can see where they're different side by side, it makes it easier for you not to switch them up, not to confuse them. So I highly recommend this book if you're into Swedish, Norwegian, or Danish and you want to see the other languages. But there are other great language families. Of course, there's the Romance language family with Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, French, Romanian, Catalan. There's the Western Germanic language family with English, German, Dutch, Afrikaans, Yiddish, Frisian. There's a Slavic language family, the Baltic language family, the Chinese language family. There's so many language families that you can explore. And the other category doesn't need much explanation. You basically choose languages that are not in the language families. So you might study Spanish, and then you might also study Japanese, which are two languages that are very far apart. But again, you are studying multiple languages at the same time. And if you're like me, you might study some languages which are in the same family and some languages which are not in the same family. So once you start learning multiple languages at the same time, the biggest issue is time management. The more languages you learn, the better you have to be at managing your time. Because obviously, the more languages you have, the less time you have for each one, and therefore the progress of each one will be slower than if you just focused all in at one time. So you really need to get good at time management and being able to study multiple languages in one day. I think in order to make progress each and every day, you should spend at least 15 minutes per language. And that's pretty good to get you started in the beginning, but ideally, once you get to the intermediate level and the advanced level, you want to start doing half an hour per language, if not more. You might even want to do an hour per language if you get to that level. But at that level, you'll already be reading books and enjoying the language in its media, so that hour will go by a lot more quickly. For me personally, I like to lead a lifestyle where the languages are just naturally included in it. So for me, I like to get language exchange partners. Right now, I have a few Mandarin Chinese language exchange partners. And so I meet with them one-on-one, and I meet with them in person. You could do this over a site like Italki, which allows you to have a language tutor or a conversation partner through the computer, through Skype or Zoom or some other video chat. But I like to do it in person because I feel like it's much realer to have someone right in front of you. You get to see the whole experience that real life is. And I really love my language exchanges because it's a real experience of speaking Mandarin Chinese with a native speaker in real life. So I get to exchange culture, I get to do it in Mandarin Chinese, and not only do I get to improve my Chinese conversation ability, but I get to learn more about the Chinese language, Chinese culture. I get to learn more about the person who speaks Chinese. And I think that's so great to be able to have a real experience and exchange with a real life human being. So that's just an example of how I fit foreign languages into my life. There are other ways you could fit into your life, like maybe you're into books or movies, and you could watch movies or films or read books. This also plays into the motivation that you want to have, because the more languages you learn, you want to make sure that you actually have a real motivation for learning all of these languages. And that's going to keep you going over the long period of time you need to become fluent and capable in each of the languages. In my personal experience and my personal thought process, you will be learning each foreign language for the rest of your life. Learning a language doesn't have a finish line. It goes on forever. You'll always be learning it. So for that reason, you need to make sure you have a good motivation to be able to continue for that long. And so that might be reading books and literature, or watching films or movies, or speaking to your family if you have it, or speaking to friends or other people who are working in a company. Whatever it may be, not only do you need this motivation, but my suggestion, my recommendation is that, again, tomorrow is not guaranteed. So if you want to learn Japanese to watch anime, for example, you should begin watching anime today. Even if you don't understand anything from it, at least being exposed to it is going to give you the motivation to think, I wonder what they're saying. I wish I could understand what's going on better. And that's going to motivate you to keep studying and to keep spending time in the language so that you eventually get the fluency. So yeah, that's it. You want to make sure you have a motivation. For me, it's real experiences in real life, but whatever the motivation is for you, it can work. And yeah, I never thought that learning multiple languages would be such a controversial subject. But when I've made videos about this before, people came out of the woodwork telling me that I'm an idiot, telling me that it's foolish, telling me that it's a terrible idea to learn multiple languages at the same time. But in my opinion and my experience, it's too late, because I've been studying multiple languages at the same time for years. I've been doing it for years already. It's too late for me. So it's worked for me. I encourage you to do it too if that's what you really want and you really want to learn those languages. Remember, tomorrow is not guaranteed, so start today. If this video helped you, consider subscribing to the channel, because hey, it's free and you might learn something that speeds up your language learning process and gets you to fluency that much faster. Anyway, I hope that helped. Good luck in your studies, and thank you so much.